looks like. And I mean, we can be in agreement or not, but this is populist discourse. They are wrong. They promise something and they fail. We need to take, power or do something. And actually, this is from 2021. But she said exactly the same thing in Katowice in 2018 when she became famous. She addressed them and said, you had 25 years, you failed, so I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the people that need to take the streets. Okay, so I don't get exactly why Greta is supposed to be climate confidence. And wait a minute, again, the proletariat would say, you stole my pay, give it back to me, how dare you? But it has been the history of this movement.
Thank you. I just we take the question.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So. Okay. Still no.
Okay. No. It's...
Oh, okay. So thank you so much for your presentation and for your 2 articles we read in preparation of that school. I was really impressed by reading a text like Apocalypse Forever. It seems to describe XR already in 2010. I honestly have a doubt that Roger Allen read the text at the time, not for assuming the critical points, but like for assuming the climate populism as a good framework. I met in Glasgow him during COP26, and I really think he always want to set up the climate populist movements. I think so. Climate populism is a useful concept and label to describe the limits of and the problem of XR. That I'm trying to study. My question is, what kinds of imaginaries are surging right now inside these movements? About that, I found very interesting just the more interviews to climate activists that reveal how they privately think that apocalyptic narratives, which are still prevalent in the movement's public discourse, are no more credible for themselves, for the climate activists' selves. In fact, the more hypnotized they are shifting to post-apocalyptic narratives. Right now, in this moment, we are shifting in that. I personally found that also in my preliminary study of XR, maybe the most populist climate movement. In fact, through their regenerative culture, that is the internal culture of XR, initially designed in order to improve resilience of the heroic individual subjectivity, personally engaging in non-violence direct action, this regenerative culture, inside that, that practices are emerging vision of the future and practices based on care and reparation, and not on cure, as you said in the texts. Are there alternatives to climate populism in the imaginaries of care and reparation that are circulating inside the movements and prefiguring by daily practices? This is my question. I have also another question on Guattari and subjectivation trajectories in ecology and in movements that he developed. I think he developed that more in 80s with Negri than before with Deleuze, but I stop here and we can share later.
Thank you. There are other questions? Okay, can you come here? Okay, on that side, you're also on the screen.
Well, thanks for the presentation. I'm sorry because some of my remarks are going to be similar to Alicia's ones. And this is a nice note for me because it means that my video account works. It won't be as much of a question insofar as a remark, probably. I think your reading of Lacanian discourses is too simplistic. you go too fast too soon in saying that discourses define a subject. They do not. They are structures. And in this regard, when we talk about what actually defines a subject through discourses, just one of them does, and is the hysteric discourse. And that's why the question about the body is so important. And that's why when you answer to the question, what the body and how does it matter so much, the answer was because the body is the bringer of the symptom, of course, because the hysteric does not just bomb with questions, with knowledge, the master, but bringing the symptom in the analytic setting with your body. Irma has something in her throat. The real is brought up as a signifier that does not that is not linked to the signifier string. Then again, the master cannot be addressed so easily as saying the master is Ursula, the master is Elon, the master is any of this is just one of the possible individualities found by the master discourse. But the master discourse, and this is really important for Zizek and for Samo Tomsic in his latest work, the master discourse is the discourse now, today, of a headless master. We have no public figure that just imposes the law. The law right now, because we're in a neoliberal state and not in just mere capitalism, addresses a master that does not have the dare to speak his name. We have no opponent. We have no antagonist. That's why university discourse is so important. That's why the production of surplus value through surplus knowledge, which we are doing right now, is the worst way of addressing such problems. And that's why the psychoanalytic discourse has to be linked with resistance discourses from post-colonial and feminist critics. And just to get to the end, you asked, how can we direct action as a political subject and not as mere acting out? Well, not just by naming a critical movement, just saying the name communism and addressing a spectre, but sustaining the burden of militants. That's the point. Militancy, of militants, which is what you bring forward. That is possible, not just addressing revolution and saying that the cataclysm has already happened, and not just saying, I don't know what do I have to do, just be responsible to yourself. That's the burden of neoliberalism. But presupposing also something more than just I do not have the responsibility of our own action, but by actually putting ourselves in the spot of the subject, because subject is being is having fidelity to an event and to a truth. That truth is could be communism, but insofar as not capitalism.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Okay. I ask you to be short because we are running out of time.
We can take another
10 minutes more.
15, 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Yes, to you.
Okay, I have three very quick questions. The first one is if you based your reflection only on the US and British environment, political environment, because I think, for example, XR or Fridays for Future was seen and received here in the south of Europe in a very different way, and with as a militant, as an activist. I prefer to refer myself as a militant. I was very I interacted with XR or with Fridays for Future with suspect, because my categories, my practice are based on the story of this part of Europe. Okay, and so a lot of practices and the idea of violence, because I think violence, you referred to violence, but I think is the real problem in these arguments, in these movements in general, not how we refer to violence. Because if we think about undocumented migrants as the body politics, we have to think about how much as white and bourgeois and students and universitarian, we are ready to act violence and to interact with violence and with repression, because we can't sustain the struggles of these people, because we have to say also in the colonial situation, as Mara said, alliances are very important. And so I think the problem is, the question is, how do you think that the imaginary of our generation in the north of the globe without violence has inflected the idea of the climate populism? Because I think it is the question, because I'm part of the Not Up movement from almost 10 years. I have a lot of friends of mine who are in jail. I have a lot of friends of mine which cannot access to university. We cannot do what we do because of repression, because they did violence to the system. And I don't think communism or every revolutionary idea cannot think about violence. So, sorry, I hope I was, I argued.
Okay.
So maybe one or two more questions. There are some. Luigi, you wanted to? Yeah. Yes. There is a question over there. Okay, come here to this. There is another. I didn't see. There is another hand. No. No, it's just you.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't know La Consom at all, and but I know La Clau and Move, and I heard it, but you didn't refer to it, so that was just I wondered how much do you base your analysis on it, and then I have a few I have a remark on the psychoanalytic character of what you do, because usually psychoanalysis, they do a psychoanalysis themselves, right? Before they work, that's what you hear. I don't know. So what I think is how much of your work is self-reflective on your own work as a political ecologist. You do political. You look at politics as political ecology, what Thomas should be, but do you act politically? Because proposing to analyze, it sounds a little bit like we have to work on ourselves to deconstruct our fantasy and emancipate ourselves from our fantasy, but it sounds a little bit, or what I wondered is where the political element of what you do is. How can you actually, I mean, I know research is not the first resource to mobilize, but maybe you want to propose or look into some kind of strategy, right? And like Claude, they proposed the socialist strategy. So I wanted to ask what you think about that, and Move talks about this pluralistic stuff. So and yet also sometimes you are a little bit simplifying, saying the apocalypse happened already. Like what apocalypse? You say it's uneven, but yet you simplify a little bit and you want to provoke, right? So there you're really politically acting, but in your work you're a little bit holding back, right?
No, I think there are other questions. Okay.
So very quickly, I was not prepared, but came to my mind one issue. So you surely are familiar with the book Climate Leviathan by White.
Yeah.
Okay. So you know this technology that they do.
Yes, I do.
So the part of the technology that is less convincing for me is the one in which they, to some extent, conflate right-wing and left-wing populism. Because to me, there should be a kind of difference. For example, there are left-wing populism that try to recover nationalism as a shelter from the globalization and whatever. Now, the discourse that you made today is even broadening the notion of populism towards the Leviathan, in a sense.
Yes.
We can say there is this global discourse of technocratic, it is populist as well. So my question is, then the very notion of populism gets out of focus, in a sense. So we should be able to distinguish between different agendas, different plans, whatever, while using this. So if you may say something on that, that would be very grateful.
Okay. Thank you. I let you answer because you collected a lot of questions.
Yes, thank you very much for the fantastic set of questions. My answer to the first one will also address, not everything, I'll come back to it. Yeah, I am not particularly interested in or convinced by myself by this notion of climate populism. So although I understand your concern that it broadens the notion of populism to such an extent that it becomes not useful any longer. The point I was trying to make, certainly in the 2010 paper, but still holding on to it in a different sort of way 10 years later, is not that I want to introduce a term called climate populism per se, but I use it as a strategic entry into what I would think a radical critique of the dominant environmental discourse. So I don't make a great claim on populism per se. I use it as a strategic device to try to elucidate what is ultimately the key of what I'm trying to achieve is the impotence of climate action. Also on the question that in the name of the people, that was indeed badly expressed on my part, and thank you for correcting it. I meant exactly this, that indeed climate governance and policy is done by bureaucratic, political and economic elites, who some of whom, not all, some of whom would say, we would want to push it further, but we can't. Nonetheless, what they do, those elites, the reason why they do it, how they legitimize it, is in the name of the people. It is in the name of securing the coherence, the survival, the happiness. It's a biopolitical configuration. I would actually call it an immunological biopolitical. Yes, regime. And that is that in the name of the people in whose name it's done, is supported by expert knowledge. Expert knowledge is mobilized by the university discourse, the governance arrangement, and is legitimized that it's good for the people to do this. You would actually push it further. It will be really good for the people. While in fact, I would argue what the repressed deal here is the sustainability of the existing socio-ecological organization.
Yeah.
So again, what I'm trying to do is a critique of neoliberalism at the end of the day, of the culture of neoliberalism, which I basically argue that much, but by no means all, much of the political action is fully accounted for and incorporated, even so, it's actively invited. It's actively invited all forms of criticism, etc. I often use myself as an example. I'm a geographer at the University of Manchester. Then you can only become a professor. As someone asked me, you can just say what you're saying as a professor. I can only be a professor in geography at the University of Manchester, and every one of my colleagues, if they're Marxist, feminist, psychoanalyst, post-colonialist, etc. Right? So that is, the critique is actually invited. It's actually well paid. I get handsomely paid for my critique, of what I do. But what is invited in terms of action is what Zizek would call hysterical acting out. That is acting without the embodied consequences. The political act is fucking dangerous. You put yourself on the line, as every emancipatory project and process in the past has demonstrated, whether it's feminist, authoritarian, or liberation of colonial states, etc. It is through the political act where the body becomes the terrain to which the political act is done. You expose yourself to violence. So that's why I've written in a different context on urban uprising. Gezi Park, for example, Istanbul, classic of its kind, so to speak, where bodies are put on the line. Now, Gezi Park failed, but we cannot understand Erdogan without Gezi Park. So that is a moment of politicization. So I want to make a distinction between hysterical acting out, which most of us do, and the political act. And there are examples in the environmental struggle. For example, the XL pipeline controversy in North America is precisely one of the heterogeneous coming together of all sorts of people, indigenous Americans, white people, colored people, intellectuals, working class, etc. Heterogeneous mixture that took a class position. Whereby the identitarian inscriptions as Native Americans, as white, as intellectuals, as gay, as heterosexual, or whatever else became articulated through universalizing demand. And by doing so, actually invoke the wrath of the other side. It's when the other side mobilizes violence, then you know you're on the right track. They will try to stop it by all means possible, usually discouraging, all sort of means. When they start mobilizing violence, you know you got something, I would argue, because that means that desperate, no one wants to lose violence. So the question of violence, it's not us who use violence. It is the dominant elite configuration that is unspeakably violent. Yeah, most notably during the COVID pandemic, that I was living in splendid isolation. Splendid isolation, I called it. Yeah, I did not have to engage in the reality of the engagement with students that I could do on Zoom. I could order my food on nine, what was my chances for survival? 98, 99, 99.9%. In the meantime, people of color, etc., who were delivering my nature, food, blood, etc., on my doorstep, had 3-4 times higher the chance of dying. That's fucking violence of quite a kind. And it is, of course, I mean, the literature from, for example, Anders Malm, how to blow up a pipeline, is actually, I would not use him as an example of impotent acting out, but rather an attempt to speak the truth. So a classic example that's loved by both Zizek and by you is Antigone, the classic figure of Antigone. She knew full well that she was heading for the death, but did what she had to do. That is to honor the laws of the God to give her blood a decent burial. She knew what he was doing. And we do know, of course, many contemporary historical examples of the feminist African-American post-colonial struggles that did exactly that. Think of the anti-apartheid struggle, etc. Without the violence and the alliances that were made at the time in the 1980s, it would have not changed, I would argue. Yes, so yes, of course, on discourse, it's not a discourse structure to the subject. What I said is that discourse structures the social bond through which a subject becomes constituted and articulated. Now, I fully agree with the argument that, well, that the master cannot any longer be embodied, identified. He or she is there, and he or she has to deal with that. Is what usually is called for as the disintegration of the master. Yeah. But here, this is not a disintegration of the master discourse. So you're absolutely right when you say we have to be careful with identifying the master discourse with named individuals. So when I used Ursula or Elon Musk, etc., they were symptoms of the expression of a master discourse. A master discourse, wherever it is always, as it were, strangely disembodied and only has symptomatic sort of embodiments. That doesn't mean that there's no antagonism. That doesn't mean that there's any conflict. Yeah, it's just not possible to identify someone or some that you have to put against the wall, take your AK-47 out, and then it will be fine. Can't do that. That was the mistake of part of emancipatory communist socialist politics in the 19th and 20th century. They actually fell in the mistake of identifying the master discourse with named individuals that had to be eliminated. Now, this is good that it's over. Yeah, the master discourse is indeed disembodied. That's why it's so powerful. But that doesn't mean that there are no antagonisms. And certainly does not mean that I cannot identify some bodies that are symptomatic expressions, that are symptomatic embodiments of that master discourse without exhausting that configuration. So yes, on the imaginary, yes, I fully agree with you that in and primarily northern in the global north, imaginary violence is utterly silenced, excluded. But not just, I would argue, in the global north. It's also in the global south. It is not any longer possible to imagine that violence is an integral part of. We like to leave it to the usual suspects. Yes, the Putins of this world is now a handy one. You know, I don't like this guy either. So what am I going to say to the Ukrainian people? Surrender? Surrender? Or do we have to think through in the face of systematic violence, ecological, I take Putin here as an example, of systematic violence that we know is continuously happening. What is our response to that? Do we put a nose in the gun? It's not, that is not good enough. So we have to be prepared in engaging in the body, which is a political act, and to at least imagine that as an integral part of what we need to consider. Hence the title of the book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, which I thought was quite interesting, etc. Although, and secondly, although I do agree that most of my examples are from the UK-US configuration, but I do think that I'm less familiar with that academically speaking. I'm very familiar with culturally, socially. I think I can make comparable arguments with some of the global south arguments, or at least, which is what I'm more familiar with. That is the way in which some global south imaginaries and understandings, particularly on the question of the pluriverse cosmo-ecological configuration that is heavily mobilized by Latin American anthropologists and cultural theories. That is the filtered acceptance and mobilization of that in the global north critical intellectual discourses, thereby disavowing, ignoring, and marginalizing all the other voices in Africa, which I know a bit better, or in Latin America too. This is not a singular voice. It's presented as a singular voice. It is not. We see the same exclusion example to name is Asher Mbembe, African theorist, etc., who I am 100% in agreement with. He's not making a case for the cosmo-ecological coexistence as an African radical politic, or the Indian scholar Ivan Kapoor just finished a fantastic book on the need to rethink universality today. I read the manuscript, I think, oh man, you're going to be slaughtered. Just the very idea of mentioning universalism in the Northern English, in the English or the US context, you get slaughtered. Nonetheless, the courage that he shows by writing about the need to think through universality today, at the moment that everything, that emancipation seemed to hinge around pursuing one individual sexual or cultural or identitarian enjoyment, rather than a process of the collective emancipation, as it used to be done. Yes, on Laclau and Move, I walk a long way with Move, in particular, more Move than Laclau. She's a Belgian after all, too, so. I just did that job. Where I part company with Laclau is that for the Laclau, it is or politicization hinges fundamentally and almost exclusively on discursive enchainment, around a set of signifiers and the making of a discursive enchainment, as if discourse is all that is. That is just about the symbolic, where the properly Lacanian configuration does pay vital attention to the discursive moment, as it were, the imaginary and the real play as much a role that's completely absent from the Lacanian universe. But ultimately, I would argue, contra the Laclau, that the domain of the political is not the discursive enchainment or the symbolic, but the imaginary. And that's where I'm on the side of someone like Castellanos, as the political is inaugurated in and through the imaginary. When Aristotle said a long time ago, humans are political animals. The only thing that makes humans different from almost any sort of non-human configuration, constellation, or species I can think of, is that we can imagine the future differently, which, as far as we know, are the non-humans cannot do so. And it's precisely that inaugurates for me the political, the very imaginary of equality, justice, nationality, nationhood, whatever. So the imaginary is for me where the struggle is all about. And I would argue that indeed in today's cultural configuration, the imaginary is extraordinarily constrained. You know, I get all these students, PhD students, wonderful people who want to do the critical, substantive, the political, ecological analysis. But why do you want to do yet another study on political, ecological injustices and equality in some other place? You know, can't we not think theoretically, intellectually about where we want to go and how to get there? But, oh, I can do that. That's too difficult. Yeah, sure, it's difficult. No, I don't know either. That's a bloody PhD. Anyway. Oh yes, on the the reflexive. Yes, yes. I've been a political, radical academic for. I'm 66 years old. For 45 years. I was a political activist before I became a Marxist and an academic, etc. Most of my intellectual and activist work over the years was fundamentally based on the imagination that critical, substantive analysis matters politically. I was a Marxist, still am actually, doing Marxist analysis and demonstrating socio-ecological exclusion, inequality, disenvironment, etc. would help in shaping, so to articulate all the domains of life. In the same way as feminist substantive theory would make that case, as post-colonial substantive theory would make that case. I had to come personally to the conclusion that that was an erroneous assumption. Assumption that substantive critical theory matters politically. What if they are disconnected? What should I do or think? Because that's how I spend my life. I read books, I write books, and I think together with others about what I should think about and how that inflects what is happening elsewhere. So for a long time, in the 1980s, late 80s, in the onslaught of post-structuralism, postmodern argument, but I could not see any political mileage, the ecological opened itself up as a wedge. In the real everyday politics of political movements, social movements, etc., it opened a wedge, which I practically, politically, and theoretically thought opened the possibility for a new emancipating politics. I was so wrong. I was so damn wrong. While indeed environmental knowledge combined with environmental action of a variety of kind did become hegemonic. It actually, I had to come to the conclusion, it actually functioned to deepen the very lore of the culture of neoliberalism, which I always wanted to fight. So the reflexive outcome here was that I was desperately looking for different modes of thinking and engagement that could cut through that deadlock. That's basically the deadlock that I mentioned in my introduction. Yes, and on the populism side, the new Leviathan, perhaps we do need a new Leviathan. How? Yes, I do think that individual anxiety, ethical responsibility, and recycling, not like, is a scam. Is a scam, given the nature of the configuration, given the global configuration and given the deep antagonisms and powerful configurations that try to keep it intact. What we are faced with is quite formidable. Yes, we do need a new Leviathan. How do we do that? How do we structure that in ways that is democratic, equal, etc.? Because we do have a history of what Leviathans do. Can that be rethought? Can it be re-articulated? I don't know, but certainly these kind of decentralized and privatized action just deepen the culture of neoliberalism and make the ecological condition worse. So yes, that's not a popular thing to say, but we may need a new Leviathan. In fact, we already have that. It's just a Leviathan of the other side. it's the master, the practice of the mindful individual responsibility, etc. That is a Leviathan. The master discourse, it's alive and kicking, not embodied in one sort of person, what sort of alive and kicking alternative master discourse. That's what ultimately what it is. How do we homogenize a new, different common sense?
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Eric, for the debate. So we close now, and there is a bouquet.
Yes.
So, and also we have
If you like it, more kind of abstract.
we have a gift for the participants.
Thanks also for online.
Yeah, and thank you to the online also. Yes.
And we meet tomorrow at 9:30 sharp.
Yeah.
9:30 sharp.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.